September 12, 1958, 11:47 p.m. Lenox Lounge, 125th Street, Harlem. Big Sam's hand was shaking as he tightened his grip on the revolver tucked beneath his lapel. It wasn't fear of pulling the trigger. It was what came after. He had taken $50,000 to betray the one man who had allowed him to breathe in Harlem without asking permission. Albert Anastasia sat at his usual table, tight to the wall, angled so he could see the entrance without advertising that he was watching it. He hadn't come to Harlem to make friends. He had come to close an account. His drink sat untouched. His attention did not. The room was full. 300 people packed into smoke, jazz, and careful conversation. People who didn't interfere in other men's business until the business happened 2 feet away. That night, commerce and panic shared the same air. No announcement. No warning. It simply began. Big Sam moved off the bar with the natural ease of a man who had stood near Anastasia too many times to raise suspicion. He was muscle. He was routine. In Harlem, routine was the best cover because nobody questioned it until it failed. At 6 feet, Sam could already hear his own breathing. At 4, he felt the room's noise drop without anyone ordering it. At 2, he drew the gun. The bartender saw it first. His eyes widened like a man realizing something too late. He tried to lift his voice, but the moment was already sealed. Sam raised the muzzle toward the back of Anastasia's head and squeezed the trigger. Click. No flash. Just that dry, metallic sound, small, final confirming something was wrong. The saxophone stopped mid-note. Conversations died in throats. 300 faces locked onto one point. Big Sam standing with a useless gun in his hand, and Albert Anastasia still seated, still, as if the mistake were exactly the kind of information he had been waiting for. Anastasia did not stand. He did not whip around. First he took a slow, measured sip, as if giving the room enough time to understand that nobody was going to save Sam with noise or speed. Then he set the glass down carefully. Only then did he turn his head. He looked at him. There was no visible anger, no performance. There was a kind of disappointment that didn't ask for explanations. In that silence, Sam understood what was truly killing him. It wasn't the misfire. It was the certainty that Anastasia had known. Because a man like Anastasia didn't survive on luck. He survived because he read a city like a map. Because he didn't react to plans, he absorbed them, bent them, and returned them as proof. Sam opened his mouth to speak, but words were worthless. In a place like Lenox Lounge, begging wasn't an act. It was permission for the other man to decide how long you suffered. This wasn't an assassination attempt that went wrong. It was a demonstration already in motion before Sam ever crossed the room. And when a man realizes he's been expected, he learns something else too. The price of betrayal was never the money. That click at 11:47 p.m. didn't save Albert Anastasia. It made him untouchable. The wall table and the error that wasn't an accident. In 1958, Harlem was fast money and slow pride. The kind of place where the wrong gesture could cost you a block, but the right one could buy you a decade of quiet. Anastasia wasn't from Harlem, and that was exactly why his presence there felt like a provocation. He wasn't looking for acceptance. He was testing resistance. Albert Anastasia understood territory differently than most men north of Midtown. To Harlem operators, blocks were inherited through blood, prison time, and memory. To Anastasia, territory was a function of enforcement. Whoever could guarantee order and punish disorder owned the ground, regardless of history. Sitting at that wall table wasn't about comfort. It was about geometry. His back protected, his sightline clean, his exit measured. Men who lived by paranoia noticed things like that. Harlem noticed him, too. Not loudly. No one challenged him directly. That would have been clumsy. Instead, the pressure came indirectly. Drinks arriving late. Familiar faces avoiding eye contact. A subtle reshuffling of chairs around him, just enough to test whether his presence would bend the room or whether the room would bend him. Anastasia absorbed all of it without reaction. That was part of the test. The mistake came from assuming stillness meant ignorance. The men watching him believed he was isolated, that he had walked into Harlem alone, stripped of the networks that made him dangerous downtown. They believed proximity was leverage, that being surrounded by unfamiliar faces weakened him. It never occurred to them that Anastasia measured rooms faster than men measured threats. The decision to act against him didn't come from bravado. It came from arithmetic. If Anastasia could sit in Harlem without consequence, others would follow. Italians with quieter intentions. Partners with longer memories. Harlem power wasn't afraid of violence. It was afraid of erosion. That's what made the idea of removing him attractive. Clean. Contained, one shot. One message. One message. But the error wasn't tactical. It was philosophical. They believed Anastasia was reacting to Harlem. In truth, he was studying it. He wanted to know who would move first, who would rush, who would confuse opportunity with necessity. The man who pulled the trigger wasn't chosen because he was loyal. He was chosen because he was predictable under pressure. By the time the plan formed, Anastasia already knew the outline of it. He didn't know every name. He didn't need to. He knew the type of men who would mistake his silence for vulnerability. He knew how long Harlem pride could tolerate an outsider before deciding to correct the imbalance. That wall table wasn't a seat, it was a filter. Anyone who tried to remove him from it exposed themselves. Anyone who stayed quiet revealed something else entirely. The error that night wasn't the misfire. The error was believing the moment belonged to Harlem. It didn't. It belonged to the man who waited. Big Sam. Loyalty as a job, survival as a debt. Big Sam wasn't born a traitor. He became one when he learned loyalty doesn't pay hospital bills, doesn't stop evictions, doesn't protect a daughter when someone decides to squeeze. In the underworld, men don't break from ambition as often as they break from pressure. And when they break, the city uses them. For years, Sam had made himself useful by being forgettable. He wasn't a thinker, he wasn't a face. He was presence, the kind of man who stood close enough to matter and far enough away to avoid notice. Anastasia liked men like that. They didn't argue, they didn't improvise, they executed. In exchange, they were allowed to exist without explanation. But existence came with costs. A daughter who needed braces. A wife whose landlord wanted cash, not excuses. A doctor who stopped returning calls once bills went unpaid. None of that showed up in the numbers Anastasia tracked. Sam understood that. He didn't resent it. He accepted it as the structure of things. The squeeze didn't come from above. It never did. It came from the sides. from men who knew Sam's name, but not his value. Men who spoke softly about solutions and loudly about consequences. They didn't threaten him directly. They talked about accidents, about how quickly children learned fear, about how debts had a way of finding their way into daylight. They also talked about money, enough to solve everything at once, not enough to feel like a fantasy, enough to feel responsible. Sam didn't go looking for a way out. He was presented with one. That distinction mattered to him. It allowed him to frame the decision as necessity instead of choice. He told himself he wasn't betraying Anastasia. He was borrowing time. He believed, or needed to believe, that the city would move on before the cost was collected. What Sam failed to understand was how visible desperation becomes to men who live on pattern recognition. Anastasia didn't hear about Sam's problems. He saw them. The late arrivals, the restless glances, the way Sam lingered too long in rooms where nothing happened. Pressure leaves fingerprints. Sam carried them openly. By the time he accepted the money, the role had already been assigned to him. He wasn't the architect. He was the instrument, chosen because he would follow through, because when the moment came, he wouldn't hesitate. Men under pressure rarely do. The debt Sam thought he was paying off only deepened. $50,000 didn't buy freedom. It bought obligation, silence, a countdown he couldn't see. When Sam stepped off the bar that night, he believed he was acting to survive. He didn't realize survival had already been redefined for him. Loyalty had been his job. Now survival was his sentence. $50,000, and the men who get paid without getting dirty. The money didn't come out of a pocket. It came off a table, from a conversation where nobody raised their voice and nobody wrote anything down. In New York, real orders didn't come with signatures. They came through intermediaries who smiled like salesmen and made promises that looked like rescue until they became a chain. The men who arranged it never intended to pull a trigger themselves. They didn't need. Their value came from remaining adjacent to violence without touching it. Clean suits, clean hands, names that rarely appeared in police files because they never stayed long enough in one place to be remembered. They specialized in alignment and making sure the right person felt the right pressure at the right moment. $50,000 was not an arbitrary number. It was calculated to feel final without being obscene. Too little, and the risk outweighed the reward. Too much, and the intent became obvious. This amount sat in the middle, where conscience could be quieted and urgency could be framed as practicality. Enough to erase debt. Enough to justify haste. Enough to make hesitation feel irresponsible. The pitch wasn't about killing Albert Anastasia. That would have been crude. It was about removing a problem, about restoring balance before imbalance became precedent. They spoke of Harlem as if it were a ledger, of territory as if it were inventory. Anastasia's presence wasn't framed as an insult. It was framed as inefficiency. And inefficiency in their language required correction. The intermediaries understood psychology better than logistics. They didn't ask Sam to hate Anastasia. They didn't ask him to believe in a future without him. They asked him to believe that someone else would finish what he started, that the city would absorb the act and continue uninterrupted. They sold inevitability. Men commit terrible acts more easily when they believe the outcome is already decided. What they didn't account for was Anastasia's relationship with anticipation. He didn't wait for threats to mature. He watched for acceleration, for the moment when quiet arrangements began to move too quickly. Money changing hands always leaves a trace, not in records, but in behavior. Men grow bolder, timelines shrink, errors multiply. The $50,000 traveled quickly, but its weight lingered. It moved from hand to hand, solving problems while creating new ones. Each man who touched it became complicit, whether he understood it or not. That was the real function of the payment. It wasn't compensation. It was contamination. By the time the plan reached its final shape, the men who financed it believed themselves insulated. They assumed proximity to money equaled distance from consequence. They were wrong. Money doesn't erase fingerprints. It redistributes them. And Albert Anastasia had already begun collecting the pattern. Why Anastasia walked into Harlem when he didn't have to? Albert Anastasia had power elsewhere. He had men. He had reputation. He had the kind of name that made problems change direction. But Harlem wasn't just another corner on a map. It was a symbol. And stepping into it meant accepting one rule. If you cross that line, someone will try to charge you for it. He understood that rule better than the men who enforced it. Harlem's power structure depended on memory, on stories passed down through prison visits and funerals. Outsiders were tolerated only if they stayed useful or invisible. Anastasia chose neither. He arrived openly, without apology, and sat where he could be seen, not to dominate, to observe. There was no financial necessity driving him north. The numbers worked without Harlem. The unions answered elsewhere. The docks paid reliably. That was precisely why the move mattered. When a man enters a space he doesn't need, it forces others to ask why. Anxiety grows in that gap. Men begin to imagine threats that haven't been voiced yet. Anastasia wasn't interested in absorbing Harlem. He was interested in measuring it. He wanted to see how quickly information traveled. Who spoke first? Who waited for permission? Who mistook caution for weakness? Harlem offered a compressed environment where reactions happened faster and mistakes surfaced sooner. For a man who survived by anticipating violence, it was efficient. His presence also served another purpose. It exposed alliances that pretended not to exist. Italian men who claimed distance suddenly became curious. Harlem operators who insisted on autonomy began making calls. Lines blurred. That blurring was useful. It revealed where loyalty ended and where convenience began. Anastasia never announced intentions because intentions invited negotiation. He preferred uncertainty. Uncertainty forced men to reveal themselves through action. A late delivery, a canceled meeting, a stranger lingering too long near a familiar doorway. Each response was data. Each adjustment narrowed the list of people who would eventually feel compelled to act. Walking into Harlem was not a gamble. It was a controlled experiment. Anastasia believed that any place worth respecting would resist him, and if it didn't, it wasn't worth respecting at all. The men who mistook that posture for arrogance underestimated the discipline behind it. By placing himself inside Harlem's boundaries, Anastasia accelerated the timeline. He forced decisions to be made before they were ready. That pressure created cracks, and cracks always widen under weight. The attempt on his life didn't surprise him. It confirmed what he came to learn. that Harlem would protect its pride before it protected its people. And once that was proven, the next steps became inevitable. The gun that doesn't fire, and the strategy that humiliates without blood. A useless gun isn't always a malfunction. Sometimes it is a trap built to make a traitor expose himself without forcing you to hunt him. Anastasia didn't need a shootout inside Lenox Lounge. He needed witnesses. He needed betrayal to have a shape, a face, and public shame before any private punishment. Violence was never Anastasia's first move. It was his final instrument. What came before mattered more. A clean execution would have erased information. A failed one preserved it. Every man in that room became evidence the moment the trigger clicked and nothing followed. Fear froze them in place long enough for Anastasia to read the room. He understood something the planners didn't. Killing a man quietly solves a problem once. Letting him live after an attempted killing solves it permanently. A dead man becomes a story. A spared traitor becomes a warning that breathes. The misfire forced a public reckoning. Big Sam stood exposed, arm extended, intent undeniable. There was no ambiguity to hide behind. No accident to explain. No time to invent another narrative. In one soundless second, loyalty was stripped down to its core. Everyone saw who had crossed the line. Everyone saw who had been wrong about Anastasia. That humiliation mattered. In criminal hierarchies, public failure carries more weight than private punishment. It poisons reputations. It stains associates. It lingers. A man executed in secret is mourned quietly. A man exposed in public is abandoned quickly. Anastasia allowed the moment to stretch. He didn't rush to retaliate. That restraint amplified the damage. Silence forced others to react internally. Men asked themselves whether they had been part of the plan, whether their names would surface next, whether staying still was safer than moving. Panic does more work than bullets when given time. The gun itself became symbolic, a weapon that failed at the exact moment it was meant to define the night. Whether it was sabotage, neglect, or design didn't matter. What mattered was the outcome. The attempt collapsed inward. The aggressor became isolated. The audience became complicit. By not responding immediately, Anastasia inverted the power dynamic. The man with the gun no longer controlled the moment. The man who survived it did. Everyone understood that if Anastasia chose to respond violently, he would do it on his own schedule, in his own setting, and without witnesses who could distort the message. This was humiliation as strategy. It removed the need for chaos. It replaced noise with memory. Men would replay that click in their heads long after the room emptied. They would remember how quickly confidence turned into exposure. Blood wasn't required that night. Something more durable was delivered instead. Fear with a face. The second after the click. Who moves and who stays still? When the shot didn't come, the room revealed its real hierarchy. The ones who hid, the ones who looked down, the ones who instinctively found a door, and the ones who stayed still because they understood movement was confession. In that single second, Anastasia measured everyone without saying a word. Panic has a tempo. It doesn't arrive all at once. It ripples. A chair scraping half an inch. A breath pulled too fast. A hand tightening around a glass instead of a weapon. Those reactions were instinctive, unfiltered. And to a man like Anastasia, they were more honest than testimony. The men closest to Sam reacted first. Not with courage, but with avoidance, their bodies angled away as if distance could rewrite association. They had known enough to suspect something, not enough to commit. That hesitation placed them low in the hierarchy. Useful, perhaps, but unreliable under pressure. Further back, a different group remained rigid. Harlem men with reputations to protect. They understood the rule that governed rooms like this. Survive the moment first. Explain later. Their stillness wasn't loyalty to Anastasia. It was loyalty to self-preservation. But that too was information. Men who could control their reactions could be managed. Men who couldn't would always be liabilities. Near the exit, two men shifted their weight in near unison, not running, not advancing, testing the path. That movement didn't go unnoticed. Anastasia catalogued it without turning his head. Men who locate exits immediately are rarely planners. They are insurance. If the plan failed, they would be gone. If it succeeded, they would return claiming ignorance. Anastasia didn't need to interrogate anyone. The room was confessing in real time. Every reaction placed men into categories. Who had expected violence? Who had hoped for it? Who had been told just enough to wait and see? This was why the failed shot mattered more than a successful one. A bullet ends behavior. A pause exposes it. Big Sam stood frozen at the center of it all. His stillness wasn't discipline. It was shock. The kind that arrives when a man realizes he is no longer part of the plan he agreed to. Anastasia knew that look. He had seen it in dock workers, union men, and rivals who mistimed their courage. The second after the click stretched longer than any gunfight. It allowed Anastasia to collect a complete picture of the room's psychology. He saw who feared him, who underestimated him, who had quietly hoped he wouldn't survive long enough to speak. When he finally moved, the hierarchy had already been redrawn, not by force, by observation. The room had told him everything. All that remained was deciding how much of it to remember. The conversation that wasn't negotiation. It was a sentence with limited options. What followed wasn't an exchange of reasons. It was an assessment. Anastasia didn't need to hear why Sam did it. He needed to know who else was behind it, who had promised protection, who had bet that an entire room would stay quiet. Betrayal is rarely solitary. It's only discreet until it isn't. Anastasia spoke calmly without raising his voice or his hands. That restraint did more damage than shouting ever could. It told the room this wasn't an emotional reaction. It was procedural. A man improvises when he's surprised. Anastasia was confirming details. Sam tried to explain. He reached for justification first, then necessity. Words about family, about pressure, about money already spent. Anastasia didn't interrupt, but he also didn't respond. He watched instead. Not Sam's face, but the faces around him. The ones that tightened when certain names were mentioned. The ones that relaxed when others weren't. That was the real conversation. Sam's voice was background noise. The room's reactions were the substance. Anastasia asked only a few questions, each one narrow, each one designed to force clarity. Who introduced you to the money? Who told you the timing was safe? Who assured you I'd be distracted? He didn't phrase them as accusations. He phrased them as inevitabilities, as if the answers already existed and Sam's role was merely to confirm them. Sam hesitated. That hesitation was decisive. In a place like Lennox Lounge, delay was admission. Men who acted alone answered quickly. Men who were protected stalled, hoping someone else would step in. No one did. The silence became collective. Everyone understood that whatever Sam said next would widen the circle or close it. Anastasia allowed that weight to settle. He understood how pressure worked. He had lived inside it long enough to know that truth surfaces when consequences feel immediate. When Sam finally spoke, it wasn't defiance, it was surrender. Names came out unevenly, without confidence. Not all of them mattered. Some were noise. Anastasia filtered them instantly. He knew which men had the reach to make promises and which only repeated them. There was no bargaining after that. Bargaining implies flexibility. This was accounting. Anastasia was deciding which debts would be collected publicly and which privately. Who would be corrected? Who would be removed? Who would be allowed to live with what they'd learned? The room waited for violence. It didn't come. That absence unsettled them more than gunfire would have. It meant the punishment was deferred, not canceled. It meant time would do part of the work. By the time Anastasia stood, the sentence had already been issued. Not in words, in understanding. Everyone in that room knew where they now stood, and more importantly, where they didn't. The night Harlem learned what untouchable means in a low voice, the impact wasn't measured in bodies that night. It was measured in the silences the next morning, and who stopped calling, and who started paying on time, and who stopped speaking about it like it was a rumor. Because when a man turns an assassination attempt into a public lesson, territory doesn't change through bullets. It changes through calculation. By sunrise, the story had already settled into its final shape. Not embellished, not dramatized, just precise enough to be understood. A man had tried. He had failed, and he had been allowed to live long enough for everyone else to understand why that was worse. Harlem absorbed the message the way it always did, quietly, collectively, without crediting a source. Corners that usually buzzed with talk went still. Men who liked to speculate found reasons to stay busy. The absence of noise was deliberate. Speaking too much after a moment like that invited association, and association invited questions no one wanted asked. Money moved differently after that night. Collections came early. Debts were cleared without argument. Middlemen who had been slow to return calls suddenly made themselves available, not because Anastasia demanded it, but because men recalculated their exposure. They realized the margin for error had narrowed. What unsettled Harlem most wasn't the failed attempt. It was the restraint that followed. Anastasia didn't announce consequences. He didn't retaliate publicly. He didn't flood the streets with enforcers. That absence created space for imagination. Men began filling that space with worst-case scenarios. Quiet corrections replaced overt defiance. Those who had been peripherally involved learned the most painful lesson. They weren't punished immediately. They were watched. Being spared didn't feel like mercy. It felt like probation without terms. They understood that their survival now depended on never misreading the room again. The word untouchable changed meaning that week. It no longer referred to a man surrounded by guards or fortified by numbers. It referred to a man who could sit alone in hostile territory, survive an attempt on his life, and walk away without rushing the outcome. Untouchable meant patient. It meant informed. It meant that even when violence failed, the plan succeeded. Harlem didn't lose control that night. It adjusted. Pride remained. Autonomy remained. But something subtle shifted. The belief that outsiders could be corrected quietly was gone. In its place was an understanding that some men didn't need permission to enter. They only needed a reason. Albert Anastasia didn't claim Harlem. He didn't need to. He left behind something more durable than fear. He left behind awareness. And once a city becomes aware of a man like that, it never fully forgets.